Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfrey. I'm the director. Over 30 years ago, I was a young academic at Imperial College in London, and I was working on biological chaos, very much in the sort of school of Robert May, who many of you will know because he ended his career in Oxford. And at that time, a really wonderful book came out, a popular book on chaos, making a new science. And me and my biological friends, we devoured it because there was a chapter on Bob in it. But the chapter I really remember is a chapter about the Dynamical Systems Collective. And this was a group of 4 students who were doing their PhD on really cutting-edge dynamical mathematics. And they were supervising themselves because there's no one in this area of mathematics to supervise them. And not only were they doing really advanced cutting-edge mathematics, they were applying it by going to Las Vegas with homemade computers in their shoes and underwear to try and beat the casino. And it all seemed quite impossibly glamorous, a Californian lifestyle in perhaps one of the most beautiful campuses of any university, doing cutting-edge mathematics and then doing possibly semi-illegal applications to it. And of course, one of the 4 members of the Dynamical Systems Collective is our speaker this evening, Doyne Farmer. And it's sort of one of those unexpected but real pleasures of the randomness of a academic career that now Doyne is both a friend and a colleague of mine in Oxford after reading about you for the first time so many years ago. After Santa Cruz, Doyne went to the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which had a huge theory group there, and Doyne set up his own group in complex systems. And Doyne's interest turned very much to the economics, the dynamics of economics at that time. And during the 90s, he took time out from academia to run a very successful company, a quant trading firm, which used strategies from statistical arbitrage to make, I think it was only in 1 year out of 20 it lost money, which is a pretty impressive track record. And then in 1999, Doyne came back into academia, joining the Santa Fe Institute. And the Santa Fe Institute is probably the most renowned center for complexity theory in the world. And then to our great good fortune in 2012, and I think Eric Beinhocker, who was in the audience, was strongly responsible for it, Doyne was persuaded to come to Oxford. And as you can see from the title there, Doyne's at the Institute of New Economic Thinking and is the Baillie Gifford Professor of Complex Systems. So Doyne has written this fabulous book, fascinating new book called Making Sense of Chaos, which is sort of part biography, part description of complexity science, and part a call for arms for a new approach for economic modeling. And I think Doyne's going to concentrate on that aspect this evening. So what we're going to do is Doyne is first going to discuss some of the ideas in his book. Then Doyne and I are going to have a conversation, and then we'll throw it open for question Q&A. And then afterwards, there'll be an opportunity to talk to Doyne, buy a copy of his book, and have a glass of wine next door. So Doyne, please give you a talk.
And thanks to everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been working on this book, I realized, just about as long as I've been at Oxford. So I have a huge sense of satisfaction and relief to be doing this now. It's been cathartic, in a sense. So I'm going to begin by just asking the question of what is the economy? What is this thing we call the economy? I'm going to give 2 answers, actually. One is that it's the metabolism of civilization. You know, we take in energy, we take in materials, we combine them together with labor, and we make waste and we make stuff that we use, goods and services. This idea actually goes back to Marx. Marx talks about this quite a bit. This particular phrase I discovered, I should just say it's performing the same function as your digestive system does. If you think of the the world as an organism, the civilization as an organism. It's doing that. And I just discovered today, actually, that this phrase that I worked so hard to come up with was actually coined originally by George Orwell in his book, Road to Wigan Pier. So at least I'm in good company. Now, my other answer is that the economy is an ecosystem of specialists. And why do I say an ecosystem of specialists? That's almost a circular statement, because actually, what is an ecosystem? Well, if you think about it, grass is a specialist at taking sunlight and earth and turning it into grass. Zebras are specialized at eating grass and turning it into zebras. And lions are specialists at eating zebras and turning it into lions. So the science of ecology is about when you have a system of interacting specialists who perform very specific roles, what happens when you, for example, get rid of the lions? It's very bad for grass, because then the zebras thrive. So you might not immediately connect lions and grass, but they're actually very connected. Now, in the past, I had a slide going to Adam Smith, and I talk about Adam Smith in the book. One of the good things about writing a book is people then tell you the things you're missing and you don't know, because I get an email from somebody who somehow had an advanced copy of my book saying, "You're completely wrong." Because it turns out Imam al-Ghazali, 700 years before Adam Smith, said something that's pretty much the same thing. He's just pointing out to make a loaf of bread, something as basic as a loaf of bread in 1100 AD, you required many different kinds of tools and many different kinds of labor and many interacting specialists. He says it takes its shape with the help of perhaps more than 1,000 workers. So now, this might all sound like idle talk. I mean, analogies are, in some sense, cheap, though they can always be very useful conceptually. But I'm going to show you that it actually leads to more than that. I'm beginning by just showing you a laptop. We have one here. How does it actually get made? It gets made, the steps to make a laptop come from actions and materials that are gathered from every continent of the world except Antarctica. So it's a very complex process. It already has an ecological-like and metabolism-like structure. Now, in fact, this idea that everything's interlinked through inputs and outputs originates with Vasily Leontiev, who's a fascinating guy. He feigned an illness to get out of the Soviet Union as a young man, and then made his way to Harvard, where he became a famous economist, and wrote down some equations that treat the economy as a metabolism, in the sense that the equations that he writes are just like equations you have for coupled chemical networks. In fact, in the 90s, I had a graduate student named Richard Bagley, and we developed a model for the emergence of metabolisms. And so when I looked at Leontiev's equations, they were very familiar to me. Now in fact, one of my other graduate students, James McNerney, led a paper where we expanded on Leontiev's equations, and we thought about technological change and derived a result that says that all else equal, the progress in a given university, in a given industry, should be proportional to, the rate of progress should be proportional to the depth of the supply chain of that industry. And so now, why would that be? Well, because if people are innovating at each step along the way, and all industries innovate around the same rate, then you experience, what a given industry experiences is the accumulation of all those improvements. And so the more steps you have, the more improvements you get. So we tested that hypothesis, and you see the test here. It's very noisy. In this plot, each little dot is an industry in a specific country. And we're plotting what we call the trophic level, by analogy with the story I told about grass, zebras, and lions. So grass would be at trophic level 1, zebras trophic level 2, lions at trophic level 3, because it's based on diet, and your trophic level's one higher than the average of the trophic levels of the things you eat. So we computed trophic levels for all these country industry pairs in 1995, and we showed that just knowing that and nothing else gives us this prediction for how much their prices are going to improve. Some measure of how much each industry's technology improved over the subsequent 14 years. And so what you can see is, although this is very noisy, if you bend the data up, you see that, and this black line is our prediction. It's not a fit, it's the prediction, that these points lie very close to our prediction. And actually, this prediction's about as good as that of development, the predictions of growth economics put together. And so anyway, that emerged directly out of the idea of really taking the economy as an ecology of experts seriously. Now, there's a caricature of economics that it's accounting plus behavior. So in other words, in economic activity, first of all, we all have balance sheets, and our balance sheets are interlinked by transactions. When I buy something from the store, that thing flows off of their balance sheet and onto my balance sheet. I have contracts sitting on my balance sheet with assets and liabilities. And so we have this vast system of interlinked balance sheets. And even if we don't explicitly write them down, we still have them. And if you think about the whole Earth, that interlinked system of balance sheets is a vastly complicated network with 50 million firms, 2 billion households, 3 billion workers, and trillions of active contracts at any given time. Accounting is straightforward but not complicated. There are rules of accounting. There are conservation laws in accounting, like the ones we have in physics. But behavior, in contrast, that's the really hard part, because behavior's neither straightforward. It's not straightforward either, and it's also complicated. So, and by the way, there's a free glass of champagne, or an extra glass of champagne for anybody who can name the painters behind all the pictures in my slide. Now, how does economic theory cope with all this? Well, in a standard economic theory, and notice I'm not talking about what's called econometrics, which is statistical analysis. I'm talking about theory, where you try and make a causal model for the way the economy works. And in the standard model, each agent has a utility function that's like a scorecard that describes what they want. Each agent has a model of the world that allows them to think about the cause-effect relationships in the world. The benchmark model that emerged in the 60s is called rational expectations. And what rational expectations means is that you can make any calculation. You have some information set, and based on that information, you can calculate anything you need to do in order to maximize your utility function. And then you assume that each agent selfishly maximizes their own utility, and you use that to deduce things about the actions each agent will take and what they imply for the economy as a whole. Now, as I already said, the dominant model is rational expectations, but many alternatives are now being exploited. This idea peaked, I would say, in about 1990 or maybe 2000, and then it came under serious attack, and there's a big effort in economics to try and understand it better. But in fact, I played a trick on you by showing you a picture of Bobby Fischer playing chess in rational expectation. Okay, Bobby Fischer's a really smart person, but when he plays chess, he's not following rational expectations. Why? Because there's so many things even Bobby Fischer can't calculate in chess. He's using a cruder model. In contrast, these two children here playing tic-tac-toe or noughts and crosses, depending on which side of the Atlantic you grew up in, these children actually often discover what you would call an equilibrium. In fact, I remember this quite vividly. When I was around 9, we were playing tic-tac-toe. I figured out that if I played the right way, I could always get a draw. And I felt like a hero for a few hours until my friends all figured it out. And then we stopped playing tic-tac-toe because it was boring. We discovered the equilibrium for tic-tac-toe. In economics, I think it's fair to say that it's struggling to incorporate bounded rationality and incorporate the idea of bounded rationality into this framework that I showed you a little while ago. Behavioral economics has now exhaustively revealed the many ways in which people aren't rational. But nonetheless, if you look at the workhorse models, like the ones the Treasury Department uses or the central banks use, they're still largely based on rational expectations. They constrain them in various ways, but they're still more or less rational expectations because there's no model to replace them with yet that can do that job. Now, complexity economics is providing an alternative based on complex system science. What do I mean by that? Well, complex system science is a movement that I helped found, emerged in the 80s, early 80s. And it's a complex system is something that exhibits emergent behavior, meaning where the behavior of the building blocks is qualitatively different, the building of the whole is qualitatively different than the behavior of the building blocks that make it up. So if you take a neuron, it's a complicated cell, not a trivial device, but you take 80 billion of them and you wire them up in the right way and you get a human brain that's capable of many, many, many things that neurons can't do by themselves, qualitatively different. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition is that the interactions of the constituent parts have to be nonlinear. That's a very weak necessary condition. And so you have to have that, but to model complex systems, starting in the 80s, a kind of style of modeling emerged that's been applied to many systems ranging from ecologies to the brain to the economy, and modeling things from the bottom up. And that's what we try and do in complexity economics. So we apply complex systems thinking and methods to economics. Now, it's a nascent science. We're still quite flexible about how we do this, but the common theme, I would say, is we model behavior directly. And this idea actually goes back to somebody named Herb Simons. Back in the 60s, when people were debating how should we model behavior in economics, there was a camp that said rational expectations, and Herb Simons says, no, we need to model bounded rationality. Now, what do I mean by that? I just mean that we aren't perfectly smart, and that's what Herb Simon meant. We can't solve all problems. There's a lot of things we just can't hope to do. And so we do the best we can. We use rules of thumb. We use reasoning as many steps ahead as we can. You know, when I play chess, I might move 2 or 3 steps ahead. Bobby Fischer probably plays 5 steps ahead. We use heuristics, like in chess, control the center of the board. A queen is better than a rook. And so we use heuristics as we need them. We sort of pull them out of a box and let us guide it. And so Herb Simon advocated this. He lost. The rest of economics thundered off in a different direction. But there's always been a community sort of burrowing away or following Herb Simon's advice. But in Herb Simon's day, this was really hard. In Herb Simon's day, computers were about 1/billionth as powerful as they are now. So we've had huge progress since then. That also means we have vastly more data, so the time has come where we can really start to do this. Now, I just want to say a little bit about heuristics. I'm showing a picture of a ship here, because one of my favorite heuristics is called the gaze heuristic. How does that work? Well, if you're sailing, the way it works is, if you want to know whether you're on a collision course with somebody, you estimate the angle that you see them at, and then you just ask, is that angle changing? If it's changing, you're not on a collision course. If it's not changing, and I've done this many times, you start to get nervous, and the longer it doesn't change, the more nervous you get, and then pretty soon you see, oh my God, and you alter your course. So that's a great example of a heuristic, but there's many, many different heuristics. Now, complexity economics naturally incorporates bounded rationality. We can put heuristics in, and we can deal with non-equilibrium behavior. That is, we don't have to necessarily have everybody taking everything into account. We can get past that and see that emerge sometime. And the way I like to think about this is that the wilderness of bounded rationality, which mainstream economists as graduate students are often advised not to get lost in the wilderness of bounded rationality by joining people like us. And their advice has some foundation. The point is, if you start with rationality, so you walk in through that rationality gate into this complicated universe of not just one human mind, but 8 billion of them, and you're trying to understand how they're all thinking, so you start wandering around that wilderness, you can easily get lost. But if you stay close to the gate, and you stay close to rationality, and then you modify it a step at a time, you can avoid getting lost. Now, there many of us, like me, who also say, wait a minute, let's go in through the other gate too. Let's go in through the zero intelligence gate. And maybe we can keep that gate in sight and add intelligence in chunks to see where we go. Now, one of the things that allows us to do that is simulation. That is, we can mimic a system on a computer, and an agent-based model, which is the working horse tool that we use, is just a simulation that involves decision makers. And so you have to actually have a model for what those decision makers are doing. And one of the wonderful things about doing it this way is you can simulate quite complicated systems like this. It's very hard to do this with equations, and it's very hard to find the optimum, which makes mainstream models have to be simple. So in agent-based modeling, we model bounded rationality directly, we simulate and we model from the bottom up. And I think a key advantage is what I call verisimilitude. That means you can make a model that really tries to represent the processes in the real world in a faithful way. That is, we can model things as if, as is, as they are, rather than as if. And I just want to say, because people always ask, AI is very useful. We use it in agent-based modeling, but it's very different because you take all the data in. It's more like econometrics and economics, where you build a model that's just based on the data without understanding causality, and sometimes it works quite well, but agent-based models are different because we still think about causality. We use our prior knowledge about how the economic system is wired, about what people do, and we incorporate all that, so we have a strong prior, as you would say in statistics. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples. We built in, starting around, actually we wrote a paper in 2012, we started earlier with a long list of authors, and the idea of this agent-based model was to just mimic the process of buying and selling houses in Washington, D.C. in the period leading up to the financial crisis. So we collected tons of data, and we just really tried to model house buying the way it happens. We had buyers and sellers and real estate agents and banks, and we just tried to model that process the way it really works, trying to ask the question of what caused the bubble, and we were able to show that the overwhelming cause of the bubble was loosened lending policy. And you can see the kind of results we got in this slide. So there's a housing index that went up and then crashed. Our model roughly tracked that, and we were able to reproduce lots of other properties of housing markets to varying degrees of accuracy. One of the big advantages I already hinted at about agent-based modeling is tractability and scalability. So this is a quote from two prominent Harvard economists. When you maximize utility, you have to solve a difficult optimization problem. And that problem gets harder and harder as the system gets more complicated. So they say it's typically not computationally feasible when there are dozens of continuous state variables. In such cases, numerical solution times are measured on the scale of years or centuries. Agent-based modeling solves this. In our housing model, we can run 1 million agents if we want to. Allows us to make things more realistic. Now, agent-based modeling is undergoing a transition now. Up until just recently, agent-based models were qualitative tools. So you would study a generic economy at a generic point in time, calibrating to stylized facts. But we now have several examples of quantitative ABMs. I think the ABM we made for Washington, D.C. is actually the first such example. And in a quantitative agent-based model, you try and model a specific economy, or maybe the whole global economy, at a specific point in time, and make quantitative conditional predictions. If we change this policy, this is what will happen. If interest rates take this direction, this is how the rest of the economy will respond. And we can evaluate those policies quantitatively. Now, a success story that I think Oxford can take credit for is the model we built of COVID. When the pandemic broke out, I assembled some of my best students and postdocs and ex-students, and we worked around the clock, literally, because Penny was doing a postdoc in Australia at the time, and so Maria and Penny and everybody else were handing things literally back and forth so that we were always working on the problem. And we built a model where we predicted the strength of the COVID shock to the economy conditioned on what policy the government took. So this was back in March, before the policies were fully committed, March of 2020. And we built this dynamic disequilibrium input-output model that made conditional forecasts about the UK economy. So we had 55 industries, we had quite a lot of deep detail, and one of the key elements we showed later for making this model work is we had a bespoke production function based on an industry survey that was performed by IHT Market, where I was an advisor, and Yakov Mutnikas, who's sitting right there in the audience, mobilized his team and said, okay guys, this is important, and within a week, we had a survey of what mattered. Because in a production function, what we realized is, if you look at, say, steel, it's got, okay, you need iron, you need energy, you need coke, you absolutely have to have those things. But the input table also has cafeterias or restaurants because they have a cafeteria, they have management consultants. You can get by for 3 months without those things. So in the survey, and this realism of the production function we built, that's essentially the recipe for how to produce things, was essential. And we tested different possible lockdown policies. They actually took the one we recommended. We did have some communication with the government. And our model predicted the second quarter 2020 GDP loss would be 21.5%, and the reality a year later turned out to be 22.1%. So we nailed it. And we predicted lots of other things. I guess I'm going to show you now a brief glimpse of how it works. We made use of the fact that we knew a lot of information about occupations and what people do. So we knew who would be able to work remotely, who wouldn't be able to go to work because they would be too close to their coworkers and would infect them. We had a list of which industries would be essential, so those people would be forced to go to work. So we built all that in. We predicted what the economic shock would be as a result of COVID before it happened. We built a model that worked with this input-output table for all the industries in the UK, and we made a prediction, which you can see here. It's the solid black line. The colored black lines are what each industry was doing, so you can see how important the heterogeneity in the models. Different industries really were affected differently by the COVID pandemic, and those black dots are the numbers for what gross output was as a function of time. And you can see we got things pretty well accurate. And this is now a breakdown industry by industry where we look at the prediction of the model on the vertical axis and what actually happened on the y-axis. There's scatter around the identity line, which would be perfect predictions, but we still did pretty well. So it was a proof of principle that agent-based models can be used in real time to make predictions about important things. And we now have a much better model where we actually collaborate with epidemiologists to build a joint model. But I'm going to fly along for a little bit. I want to try and finish this fairly early so that we can have plenty of time to discuss. We also have a nice model of occupational mobility that, you know, is an agent-based model for job transitions. Each node, each circle in this picture is a given occupation. The lines correspond to which occupations somebody in a given occupation can transition to, and it's a literal zero intelligence model. The agents just apply to the jobs that other agents have applied to in the past, and they're randomly accepted or rejected based on that. And this model makes some nice predictions, like it can predict if we plot vacancies against unemployment. There's a famous thing called the beverage curve, and we're able to at least fit the real beverage curve, which, by the way, says that when we go into a recession, this is 2008, the level of unemployment as we go in is lower than the level of unemployment as we come back out. So the question is, why does that happen? So from a zero intelligence model, this model has a Nobel Prize associated with it. That's a rational expectations model, so we're competing directly with that. And we now even have quantitative macro models, that is, models that model the whole economy. This is a paper by Sebastian Poledna, one of my ex-collaborators, and that came out about 5 years ago. And we have an Oxford model, and there's my student Samuel Visa, who's led the effort to build this model. It's actually an effort involving about 10 people, some of whom are in the room right now. And so this is a diagram of the model, and we really try and simulate the economy as best we can. We have a heterogeneous population that can have millions of agents in it, where we can match the gender and economic status and so on, and see how everybody gets affected by economic. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask, why does the economy change? In a mainstream macro model, the economy changes because of what are called shocks. So you picture Zeus up on Mount Olympus, and he decides to do something at random, and then the models respond. It's been called a rocking horse economy because it's like a rocking horse. You hit the rocking horse, and then what the models do is they model how the rocking horse responds to being hit. Then the rocking horse gets hit again, and again, the model responds to how it's being hit. The shocks are random. Fundamentalist buys an undervalued asset. I think the other three, none of these assumptions are hard to argue with. Now, so the model looks kind of like this. You know, the fund and the bank are both affecting the price and choosing their actions, following those rules based on that. Now, what happens, I'm missing a slide. Oh, well, that's okay. So what happened when the model, when the agents aren't using too much leverage, or when the banking sector is small, it just goes to something flat, no change through time. So the leverage, the price, everything's just constant. But when those assumptions are violated, when the banking sector gets bigger, or when they start to use more leverage, the economy spontaneously oscillates, and we can get actually oscillations, that's the slide I'm missing, that look a lot like that picture. Now, I want to end by saying a little bit about climate change. Bill Nordhaus has famously said that the optimal level of global warming is 3.5 degrees. He got a Nobel Prize for that. But we argue that he didn't take technological change properly into account. In particular, technologies improve at very different rates, and the rates are highly persistent. So if you take a set of technologies like this, technologies in college, we're taking a very broad definition here, hospital services over a 20-year span in the United States, we see some things like college went up by more than a factor of 2, and other things like television sets went down by a factor of 20 in the same period. Very different behavior. And furthermore, if the series is going up, it goes up every year. If it's going down, it goes down every year. These things can be very persistent. So Francois Lafond and I built a model to take advantage of this, where we make probabilistic forecasts, and we gathered a lot of data, we tested it on the data. And so here you can see, for example, the historical data for solar energy, solar photovoltaic energy, when we made the forecast in 2013, and the subsequent behavior. And so the subsequent behavior is within the probability bands we expect. Here, each little band is 5%. There's a 5% chance you're out in the white region, but 95% of the time, you're somewhere in the center. So we developed this, tested a lot of things, showed it works, and it works in the sense that we were able to predict the uncertainty. And that's really important because a prediction really has no use unless you have some idea how accurate it is. So the key thing we did is be able to state with some confidence how accurate our predictions were. Now, if you look at the global energy system, and I don't want to go through this in too much detail, but you can see that in terms of deployment, technologies like solar energy, which is this line here, wind, which is the blue line, batteries, hydrogen-based fuels, are all shooting up at an incredible rate right now. They've also been shooting down in cost, in contrast to oil and coal and natural gas, which cost now about the same as they did 140 years ago. And so we put that together to make scenarios for the energy transition and see how much they would cost. And I'm giving you the upshot here. But basically, basically what we were able to show is that if we have a transition that's based around solar, wind, batteries, and hydrogen-based fuels as energy storage devices, that we can potentially do a very cheap energy transition. In fact, not just cheap, but profitable, because electricity gets so cheap in the future that we net save money in the long run. Now, I just want to wrap up by saying we're facing serious problems, financial crises, inequality, climate change, complexity economics offers new solutions. I'll skip that slide. We're building an integrated climate economics model, so we have several of the pieces of it built. We're trying to build the model in a modular way so we can put all the pieces together one at a time and then assemble them together when we need them. We're doing a lot of things to try and build a better map of the economy, to understand supply networks and how to infer what they are even when we don't have the data. We've started a company called Macrocosm Incorporated that's trying to scale up these ideas, reduce them to practice, make predictions day in and day out. We're initially focusing on the climate transition in hopes that these tools can guide us to a better future. And as I think everybody knows here, I've written a book. So and I hope you'll buy 1,000 copies each. So thank you. Well, we're going to David first, and then
you go ahead.
Okay, all right. So let's do we'll do this one first, and then you. Okay? So you stay there, and we'll do, yeah. Okay, David.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, you want David? Okay, David, then you go ahead and just stand up then, and stand up and ask a few questions.
All right, okay.
So let me just say what's going on here. David Johnston's a dear old friend of mine. He's done various stunts for me when I've done lectures in the past. He's quite a good amateur actor. And I was going to have him actually interrupt me outraged at the things I was saying, but Charles wisely said, no, that's too crazy. But so the alternative, I realized, I want to get across the perspective of a mainstream economist. So I actually consulted some of my mainstream economist friends to get a list of questions. And by the way, I've given a lot of talks. I've heard all these questions many times. But so David's going to go through a few of them just to give you a flavor for how these things work. Imagine it as Dr. David Johnston. Yeah. From the economics
department. Yeah.
And by the way, if there are economists here, mainstream, I hope there are, please add on in the question section if you don't think I got the key questions in.
Dr. Farmer, if you are some sort of doctor, your approach to complexity economics is ad hoc, and you are therefore doomed to failure because of the arbitrary assumptions you need to make so often.
Yeah, well, you've got a point. We do have to make some ad hoc assumptions. Now, as any macroeconomist here will know, the mainstream macroeconomists have also had to make a lot of ad hoc assumptions in recent history. And the hope is that we can ground those assumptions as much as possible in real data and in real knowledge about the world.
Dr. Farmer.
Yes.
Your simulations function as black boxes, though. Economics is about explanation, not just prediction. And you can't explain everything that functions inside a black box.
Another good point. Agent-based models can get complicated. And when they start to get complicated, it can start to be hard to see what's inside and what's causing what. And you actually end up finding out that you need to spend as much time building diagnostic tools. You have to build stethoscopes and stick them inside the different parts of the model so you can see what's going on. It becomes a little bit like biology. You have to do knockout experiments where you pull out part of the model and see how it changes things. In fact, that's what we did in the basal leverage cycle model that I mentioned. So you have to be able to strip things down when you need, and you have to have good graphics so you can see what's happening inside the black box, illuminate the interior of that black box.
But complexity economics lacks mathematical rigor, Dr. Farmer. Equations are more compact and easier to use, and they're easier to follow than simulations, and they're transparent in how they work.
That's true. And you know, if you give me a choice between a complicated simulation model and an equation, I'll take the equation any day. But the question is, does the equation explain reality? And I think the bigger problem in economics is figuring out how well do models represent reality? And I'd rather live with a simulation model that makes me work harder to understand it, but represents reality better. And because at the end of the day, we can get more verisimilitude with our simulation models, I think we need to investigate that path.
You, though, portray people's reasoning as too primitive. In your models, instead of modeling people as hyper-rational, you sort of assume that they are total morons.
Well, and actually, a story, one of my papers was picked up by a Russian website, a Russian joke website, and which we had said it was a zero intelligence model, and they translated our main conclusion is that financial traders are complete idiots. But it's true. We start, the wilderness of bounded rationality. It's a good idea to start simple at one end or the other. Now, we start stupid and then add intelligence. And sometimes we can see even something as simple as a dartboard model where the agents throw darts at a dartboard can tell you a lot about the world. Why? Because we can build in the institutions of the economy into the model, and we can actually probe what those institutions do with our primitive random models, and then we can make them more sophisticated as we need to. So perhaps we'll meet in the middle of this wilderness.
Perhaps. Your models don't actually work that well yet, though, and you can outperform some aspects of current models, but you're not consistently outperforming all models.
No, that's true. We're a new science. It's been a small effort relative to the mainstream effort, and we still have a ways to go. But we now have a few examples where we seem to be doing better, and some examples like in the macro models I mentioned, we're now able to match the performance, which is kind of striking given that we haven't been working on it that long. Sebastian Paledno was a graduate student working largely alone when he made the first example of that. So the race is on. It takes a model to beat a model, and so it's our models versus yours.
Well, finally, my real complaint is that you largely ignore more than a century of tradition in economics.
That's true. Sometimes you've got to try different approaches. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Johnston.
All right, thank you.
That was great, and I wonder if you started off a trend of bringing your own sort of critiques along with you, and those were really great questions. And actually, a couple that I were going to ask, you've already answered it. You've already asked them. One of the fascinating things about reading your book and coming from a different field is one thinks about parallels. And I must say, I really appreciate some of the biological metaphors, and also that you're careful about them. A bugbear I have reading biological metaphors in a lot of economics is confusion on evolution and economics, and you're very on evolution and ecology, and you're very careful about that. And in biology, agent-based modeling had a period maybe about 15 or 20 years ago where we really expected it to give more insight than it has over the last 20 years, with one or two exceptions. And you'll know, having worked at Santa Fe, that understanding of the complexities of social insects structure is one. And I think one of the main reasons it hasn't worked in biology is we don't have the data. And I think one of the things that really struck me from reading your book, and I'd like you to expand a little bit on it, is the richness of data that is becoming available in economics, and is becoming increasingly available. And you talk about the richness of it and also what needs to be done to make it even more rich. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the data and how it goes.
Sure. And maybe I can just say, the idea that biology is a good metaphor for economics goes all the way back to Marshall at the beginning of the 19th century. But I've really worked hard to try and turn it into something more quantitative and explicitly useful. One little correction I would make is epidemiology, agent-based models have been hugely useful. So if that counts as biology, then that's a big win, actually. But it's true that if you can't get data on something, you're sort of stuck. You can make qualitative models, but you can never really pin the model down to what the data is doing. And that's the big change that's happening now in agent-based modeling. Agent-based models really want microdata. We want data about what the individuals are doing. And so as we start to get more of that kind of data, that's really going to drive forward a more quantitative, data-driven approach. And that's one of the reasons I'm so optimistic. No.
And perhaps you might say a little bit more about some of the data that's available. I know you work with colleagues in Austria and places like that are really trying to change the scale of data that is available for modeling.
Well, many of the central banks have gone on a big campaign since the financial crisis to gather detailed data about balance sheets of banks, about different agents in their economy. Many countries, not many, some countries have passed laws that change the way they collect their VAT data. Because if you just collect VAT data in the right way, you just have to know information about who's transacting with whom, you can actually reconstruct in fine-grained detail the workings of the economy. So some countries like Ecuador, Chile has recently implemented this, Hungary, and in Hungary, you know, they can really go and dissect what's happening in the economy and do very detailed experiments. We've worked with people from Ecuador and Hungary, and it provides a great testing ground and a great laboratory for understanding the economy better.
The other reason I think why agent-based modeling hasn't worked as well and I should have said for ecology, I completely understand in epidemiology it's been more successful, has been, and it's already been brought up, the issue about you have so many choices of things that you can tweak. And so you can get, in many ways, many different results in many different ways. Could you say a bit more about how you defend that?
This sort of amplifies on one of Dr. Johnston's questions. So you have to use a lot of restraint, you know? This statement's attributed to Einstein, although I've gathered it's not actually due to him, but that, you know, a model should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So you should emphasize both sides of that. You need enough things in there that you actually capture what's going on, but you don't want irrelevant stuff because that just clouds the water. And you really, one of the main reasons you need the data is to pin things down. In our agent-based model of Washington, D.C., for example, the limiting factor was we could not get data on rentals. So rentals play an important role. Buy-to-let investors, as they call them in the UK, play an important role. We had no data about that. We had data from the US Census Household Survey. We actually were able to get somebody in the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, to run analysis. We knew how many people in which income bracket moved in and out of Washington in each year. We had but you really need that kind of data to make these models be really as accurate as they can be.
So the final thing to ask you, so if you were talking to someone in the Bank of England or the Fed, or a senior policymaker in Treasury, and they asked you the question, so what is the killer application of an agent-based modeling approach that we would not have got from a simple bounded rationality, the standard models in economics? What's the killer example that you would try and provide?
Well, I'm not going to give one example, but I'll give a few.
Feel free.
And they're all related to things I said. I think our COVID model is one example. The COVID model is an illustration of how shocks propagate through the economy when you have a disaster. When you have a sudden event, COVID was effectively a disaster. It was a good disaster in the sense that it didn't disrupt the infrastructure. It's not like a hurricane. Makes it actually a little easier to model. But our model, we could see how the shocks propagated from demand to supply and supply to demand, upstream and downstream in the economy, colliding with each other in a disequilibrium fashion. We moved along at a daily time step. We kept track of inventories. Mainstream models can't do that. Another one is the labor model I talked about. There's really no competing model for labor because those models just can't really model that question. And yet another one is the housing markets. And I forgot to say, these housing market models, like the one we developed in Washington and amplified here in Oxford, are now used by at least 5 or 6 central banks throughout the world. So they have teams that do that kind of thing, and so that seems to be catching on. And we're used to advise, like the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, when people were worried we were in a housing bubble.
It's very interesting what you say about the pandemic, because my understanding is that the links between epidemiology and economics and Treasury were pretty poor. And I think when one thinks about pandemic preparedness and preparing for what hope will be a rare event, then bringing in these ideas much earlier than they were done last time would be important. Right, I'm going to go to questions, and unfortunately our web stream has died, so it's only questions from the floor. Who would like to go first? And I would encourage a more traditional economist also to ask questions.
Please, if there's one here.
A lady there.
Hi there, Lisa McSorley from the Blavatnik School of Government, and prior to that the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. So I do believe Liz Truss called us the mainstream orthodoxy, so maybe that qualifies. Two big questions. First of all, on risks to your approach. Do you think that, given we have got so much data from so many different providers, is it really a question of whether we can trust those that have most access to it? For example, I'm thinking particularly of Cambridge Analytica scandal and their attempt to influence the Brexit vote. So is it about kind of trust in who actually owns and controls the data? And second, you said it takes a theory to beat a theory.
Wait, sorry, say what?
It takes a theory to beat a theory.
Yeah.
Do you think then this is the kind of search for a grand theory, or do you think complexity economics can actually complement and support mainstream economics, or even reinvigorate it? That some of the economic questions that we kind of, I suppose, Keynes, 1940s, national accounts framework, 1950s, do you see complexity economics complementing, or is it a rival for a grand theory? Thank you.
Excellent questions. So I think the first question was mostly about confidentiality. I mean, can we keep all this data secret? I certainly hope so. I mean, computer scientists are working hard to give us protocols and ways of doing this that allows us to preserve confidentiality at the same time that we know enough about, because, in our models, we don't care at all what your name is or anything like that. We just want to know roughly what kind of person are you. So we will take the real data, replace it with a data set that captures the essential things we want to know, and build synthetic populations. Now, complement versus competitor, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think it's certainly a complement, as I listed some examples where I don't think mainstream models can compete very well because they're just not well suited to them. But we're also trying to go head to head with our macro model and see if we can beat the competition. I think it's a healthy thing. And I hope we can learn from each other and integrate those things together rather than having this just be collision.
And there are great models from other fields, for example, the medical world and Open Safely, the initiative at Oxford, about how one can get access to data in a way that doesn't compromise privacy. A gentleman in the aisle there with the black jumper.
Thank you. Christian here, data scientist my name is Christian, data scientist at SoundCloud, so practitioner. After a couple of years in industry, it's quite refreshing reading your book because it makes quite a bit more sense than the standard economics that you learn, that you realize not necessarily holds up when you're trying to solve real problems out in industry. I've been working quite a while with traditional machine learning approaches, and now wanting to go further into the causality of things. So I wondered if you could comment briefly on the distinction between the agent-based modeling approach and the system dynamics approach that's been proposed by MIT, and also Perlian causality, because it seems like there's...
And also what?
Perlian causality. So like you have top level modeling, you have social
Yeah.
science, but you also have like this in between more causal-based modeling as a toolkit.
Sure, thank you. So first of all, you reminded me of something I meant to say at the beginning of my talk, which is the purpose of my book is not to criticize economics. My purpose of my book is just to offer an alternative. So let's compare three things. One is AI, machine learning AI. Another is what he referred to as system dynamics. So system dynamics is a formalism developed back in the 60s, really, by a fellow named Jay Forrester, that involves using simple, ordinary differential equations. You couple them together in a sort of standard way. You figure out what affects what. In those days, you even have a plug board. You could just plug everything together and run a simulation in a very quick and dirty manner. And system dynamics can be great for doing that kind of thing. You want to just get a qualitative feeling for what's going on. Now, John Sterman at MIT has pushed it a little further than that, but I think most people will agree it can be pretty difficult to really calibrate a system dynamics model so that it can accurately render those kind of systems. And it's particularly hard when you have parts of the system that aren't easily captured by differential equations. Like in housing markets, how do people actually sell houses? Well, you don't just match supply and demand. Somebody looks around for a house that's similar to their house, they make a price, they try to sell it at that price. If they don't sell it at that price, they mark it down. We did that in our agent-based model of the housing market. That's hard to do with a differential equation or a mainstream model. Now, then the other alternative is machine learning. Machine learning is great. I was even a little bit involved in the early days in the 80s, and we used it at my company, prediction company, in the 90s. And so machine learning is great when you have lots of data and you want to have a predictive model. But if you need to do counterfactual experiments, counterfactual conclusions, like what would happen if we changed policy, that's harder to do with a machine learning model because it's learned what's happened. It can't distinguish what might happen. It's also less useful, as is in the case in economics, when you're really data limited. In agent-based modeling, we can put priors into the models by looking at psychology, by looking at institutional structure, and so on. So I'd say, one of my models is use the right tool for the job. So if you want to do a quick and dirty analysis, do a system dynamics model. If you want a problem where you have wads of data, you want to do predictions, machine learning. But there's a category where agent-based model is really the right tool, which is where you might still have a lot of data, but where you need either causality or where you're data limited or both, then agent-based modeling can be the right thing to do.
Thank you. Forgive me, I'm going to go on to another question. There is someone immediately in front of you, and then there'll be someone in the front.
Thank you very much, Professor. Robert Hercock from BT, but also an ex-Santa Fe student many years ago. How long do you think it'll be before agent-based modeling is the norm? How long before it phase transitions to become the dominant paradigm?
Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, I hope, I want to see this in my lifetime. So I'm about to be 72. So, I'd like to see it happen in the next 10 years. And I'm actively trying to make that happen. And I think we have a pretty good shot. So I would guess 10 years is around, right? And as I said in my book, I don't think it's if, I just think it's when. And it might be 20 years, might be 5. But that's my guess.
Thank you. Question in the front.
Hi, George Curry-Jones from the Smith School. Do you think, through this approach, do you believe you could achieve a perfect predictive model of the whole global economy? And do you reckon that would be possible through my lifetime, assuming I don't get hit by a bus on the way home?
Perfect is a pretty big qualifier, right? Certainly not. We're never going to have a perfect model. There's never a perfect model of anything. But I think the more relevant question is, can we achieve a useful model? And that's what I was responding to there. And, our goal, we are ambitious. My dream is that within a decade, we would be able to do for economic planning what Google Maps does for traffic planning, so that we could really see what's happening in the economy in fine-grained detail. That was my last slide about maps. I kind of skipped over, and where we could ask that tool a lot of questions, like a business could ask, how do I make my strategy work better? How do we make the planet population inequality? How do we reduce inequality? How do we make a sustainable economy? So we'll at least give useful answers for those questions. We're never going to be perfect. We're always going to be a long way away from perfect.
Question here.
So I'm Pedro Ferreira. I'm a physicist here. One of the things you say is you can control the priors in your model. So you know how to control your priors and you can play with them. But I didn't see in any of the curves an uncertainty due to those priors. I'd expect to see bands and not just lines. So yeah. Why not?
Well, that's just because I didn't show you those slides. We do worry a lot about uncertainty bands almost obsessively about that. And, and so we do try and think in probabilistic terms, because that's, after all, what our models are imperfect. So we really try hard to quantify that part. We can't do that everywhere, but we do it wherever we can.
Thank you. Any further questions? Don't pass that. I have one, and it's around chaos, and an area that you've made many substantial contributions to over the years. And I guess going back 30 years ago, the time when GLEEP was published, then there was a hope that there would be chaotic systems that were relatively low dimensional, where we could use explicit techniques to try and understand them. And then reading your book, am I right in thinking, in concluding that you think that chaos is still very important, but it's very high-dimensional chaos? Perhaps you might just explain. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, what is the role of thinking about chaos in complex systems such as the economy, and what contribution does an understanding of the underlying mathematics make to prediction and understanding?
It's a very good question, particularly given that chaos ended up on the cover of my book. But thankfully, my publishers were very good at helping me find a good title that would be catchy. But so chaos comes in different flavors, and part of my thesis was about, we have simple chaos, where you have a few very simple equations that can actually generate very rich behavior. And just so everybody knows, what does chaos mean? It's when you have a dynamical system, like from Newton's laws, where in principle everything's deterministic. You have a rule that tells you for any state in the present where it goes in the future. But if the system is chaotic, small changes in initial conditions are amplified exponentially, and they become very large in finite time into the future. Now, it turns out that you can have that even in very simple equations. And when you have it in a simple equation, if the world is really described by something simple, you can really use that to make better predictions. So for example, people who study heart arrhythmias are able to predict things about what's going on in the heart, because heart arrhythmias represent a bifurcation to a fairly simple chaotic system. And so there are some systems like that. Dripping faucet going drip, 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 irregular, low-dimensional chaotic system. It's not that important to be able to predict the next drip, but you can. And we actually showed that we could make better predictions with nonlinear models of ice ages and sunspot cycles. So there are things where it's clearly useful. But the problem is when you go to more complicated chaos, then things get, for most practical purposes, random. Not quite. Look at the weather. The weather is high-dimensional chaos. And we can predict the weather better than we could. But we are not taking, we can't do it just from data. Once chaos gets complicated, you really have to have a model that captures all of the key features that you can use in order to exploit that underlying determinism, as we do in the weather. And one of the things I talk about in the book, I do make a comparison to the history of weather forecasting, and I try to argue that we really should be trying to do the same thing for the economy, and that because the fact that many of the movements of the economy are possibly due to chaos is a clue that maybe we can gain by doing that.
Thank you. We do have an online question. Jonathan,
we do. We've got a question for Doyne from Samuel online. And the question is, in terms of agent-based modelling software tools, can you comment on the landscape? Do you need to build your own tools, or are there good open sources your group uses?
I wish. No, the answer is basically no. There are some packages out there people can get. Some of those packages can be useful to build on. But when you get to modeling economies, there are no packages out there that can really provide the kind of modular building blocks we hope to have. Someday, we would like to have those in the future, so you could model an economy with a Lego kit. Okay, I'd like to use this kind of market. I'd like to use these kind of decision-making rules, and plug them all together. But right now, we don't have that. So basically, at this point, pretty much everybody builds their own version. Now, we're trying to build our macro model in an open source way so that anybody who wants to join can take the pieces of the macro model or expand on it and build on it, using it as a starting point. And maybe some of that's starting to happen.
I think we have a final question right at the very back.
Hello, Anthony Murphy from UBP. Just got a couple of questions around the calibration of the models themselves. So as you're adding more detail to the models, as you're collecting more data, as maybe the agents become more heterogeneous, how do you find the models themselves, or the predictiveness of the models improve? So are you seeing it kind of linear, or do you get these step changes? And then as you've looked across different markets, the housing market, the labour market, and so on, any comment on the structure of these markets and what's sort of important in terms of the accuracy of the model in each of those, like a kind of deeper models, or deeper markets or broader markets, kind of easier to gain greater accuracy in these types of models? Any sort of broader comments around the different structures themselves?
Yeah. So calibration of agent-based models is a big problem. Dr. Johnson could have asked me about that one too. But it's something we've been working on for a while. I have a postdoc and ex-student. I have several students. Annie Colonesco and Mike Wooldridge, I don't know if he's here, are also part of they're leading a major project called a Large Agent Collider, where we have 7 postdocs who are all working on calibration of large agent-based models. So we're getting better at that. And it is something that's key that we need to do to really solve these problems. My graduate student, Samuel Visa, who you saw a picture of over here, for example, recently took a version, well, that was inspired a little bit by Sebastian Pledna's model, and by calibrating, he showed that we get better performance out of sample as a result of calibrating the model. So we're seeing that we can make progress in that. But we still have a long ways to go, because once a model gets complicated, particularly if it has discontinuities in it or things like that, searching the space of parameters can become difficult. And you have to be very careful, because it's incredibly easy to overfit by tuning all the parameters in your model to make it match some historical data. But what it really finds is all the noise in the data. And so when you see some new data, it generates garbage. So you really have to work hard to make sure that that doesn't happen.
So we're coming to the end, and before I thank you, Doyne, I know you want to call out your publisher.
I did. I really want to thank Keith Mansfield here, who was my editor at Penguin.
Please stand
up. Keith did a fantastic job, because I did work hard to make this book understandable, but then I handed it to somebody and I realized, oh gosh, it's not understandable. So Keith was one of many pieces of litmus paper that helped me in that. Many of my friends suffered as well. But Keith was wonderful, because he did the last round, and he really empowered me to put more zing in there, make the book more fun, and make it read much better, and encouraged me the whole way. Enormous pleasure to work with.
Thanks very much. And together you have made an extremely readable book. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've had pole dancing, you've had drama, and you've had a wonderful example of how ideas from different disciplines can come together to do something new. Doyne, it's been a pleasure having you involved with the Martin School over the last 12 years since you came to Oxford. Continue working with us, and please join me before we go next door for a glass of wine to thank Doyne for a really splendid presentation.
To thank Charles too. Thank you, Charles.